The camera is shaking. Audio is clipping from Bryce Johnson screaming. Through the chaos, you can hear something else, something massive moving through the brush. The thermal camera captures a heat signature that shouldn't exist, and then everything goes black. What happened in those 11 minutes of missing footage would change everything about Expedition Bigfoot. Not just the show, not just the investigation, but the way Bryce Johnson thinks about what's actually out there in those woods. Because whatever attacked him that night, it wasn't supposed to be real. Stay until the end of this video, because we're going to break down every second of the footage that almost didn't air, the injury that required immediate medical attention, and the detail in the thermal imaging that experts still can't explain. But first, you need to understand who Bryce Johnson is and why this attack represents something fundamentally different from anything that's happened on Expedition Bigfoot before. Bryce Johnson isn't your typical Bigfoot researcher stumbling through the woods with a flashlight hoping to catch a glimpse of something strange. He's a wildlife biologist with over 15 years of field experience. He's tracked mountain lions in California, studied bear behavior in Alaska, documented wolf packs in Montana. He knows how animals move, how they hunt, how they react when cornered or threatened, which is exactly what made him valuable to Expedition Bigfoot when the show launched on Travel Channel. The production needed someone who could distinguish between normal wildlife behavior and something genuinely anomalous. Someone who wouldn't mistake a bear for Bigfoot or interpret every broken branch as evidence of Sasquatch activity. Bryce brought scientific credibility to what could have easily become another sensationalized cryptid show. But here's what you need to understand about Bryce's approach to the investigation. He went in as a skeptic, not hostile to the idea of Bigfoot's existence, but demanding evidence that met scientific standards. Footprint casts weren't enough without clear dermal ridges and anatomically correct proportions. Audio recordings needed to be analyzed against known animal vocalizations. Eyewitness testimony had to be corroborated with physical evidence. For the first 3 seasons of Expedition Bigfoot, Bryce maintained that skeptical stance. The team found interesting data, thermal hits that were difficult to explain, vocalizations that didn't match cataloged animal sounds, massive footprints in remote locations. But Bryce always found ways to maintain scientific distance. Possible bear, could be misidentified elk, might be audio contamination from equipment. His colleagues, Dr. Maria Mayer and Russell Accord, sometimes expressed frustration with Bryce's caution. They'd capture compelling evidence, and Bryce would immediately start poking holes in it. But that's what made the team dynamic work. Maria brought primatology expertise and field experience from decades of wildlife research. Russell provided tactical knowledge and an intuitive understanding of how to track elusive creatures. And Bryce served as the scientific filter, preventing the investigation from veering into pseudoscience. Which is why what happened during the Season 4 investigation is so significant. Because Bryce Johnson, the skeptic who'd spent years demanding rigorous proof, experienced something that shattered his carefully maintained scientific objectivity. And that experience was captured on camera. The investigation that would lead to Bryce's attack took place in the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest, an area that's been a hotspot for Bigfoot sightings for over a century. But this wasn't a random location chosen for dramatic scenery. The team had spent months analyzing historical sighting reports, geographic data, and environmental factors to identify a specific valley that met all the criteria for potential Sasquatch habitat. The valley was remote, accessible only by hiking several miles through challenging terrain. It had a reliable water source from a creek that ran year-round, dense forest cover that would allow large animals to move undetected, and perhaps most importantly, a history of consistent sightings spanning decades, reported by loggers, hikers, and indigenous communities who'd lived in the region for generations. The expedition plan was methodical and scientific. The team would establish a base camp and conduct systematic searches using thermal imaging, audio recording equipment, camera traps, and traditional tracking methods. They'd work in pairs for safety, maintain radio contact, and document everything. Standard protocol for Expedition Bigfoot investigations. But there was something different about this location from the moment they arrived. Russell noticed it first. The forest was too quiet. Not the peaceful silence of wilderness, but an unnatural absence of sound. No birds, no insects. Even the wind seemed muted. Russell, who'd spent years in remote forests, said it reminded him of the eerie calm before a major predator appears. When bears or mountain lions are near, smaller animals go silent. The forest holds its breath. The first night passed without incident, though nobody slept well. The second day brought their first piece of evidence, a line of massive footprints near the creek, pressed deep into mud. Bryce measured them at 17 inches long, far larger than any human foot and showing a pattern of weight distribution that suggested bipedal locomotion. He made casts, took photos, documented everything with his characteristic thoroughness. That evening, as darkness fell, the team heard something that made everyone stop talking. A vocalization echoing through the valley, starting low and guttural, almost like a growl, then rising to a high-pitched scream that seemed to last impossibly long. Mireya, who'd studied primate vocalizations worldwide, said it didn't match any known species, too complex for a bear, wrong frequency range for any North American ape or monkey. They decided to investigate, and that decision led to what would become the most significant and disturbing evidence in Expedition Bigfoot history, because Bryce Johnson was about to come face to face with something that would force him to reconsider everything he thought he knew about what exists in those forests. At 11:47 p.m., Bryce and Russell set out to investigate the vocalization's point of origin. They were equipped with thermal imaging cameras, handheld radios, and enough camera equipment to document anything they encountered. Mireya stayed at base camp, monitoring their position via radio and reviewing real-time thermal feeds from their equipment. The footage from the first 20 minutes shows standard nighttime forest investigation. Bryce sweeping the thermal camera across the tree line, Russell calling out periodically, trying to provoke a response. Both men moving carefully through underbrush, their calm professional demeanor intact despite the darkness and isolation. At 12:08 p.m., the thermal camera picks up a heat signature approximately 200 yards ahead, large, upright, moving slowly through the trees parallel to their position. Bryce's narration becomes more focused. He's describing what he's seeing in real time. Bipedal movement, estimated height between 7 and 8 feet based on comparison to surrounding vegetation, behavior that suggests awareness of their presence. They decide to close the distance. This is where viewers who've watched the episode notice the shift in Bryce's body language. The scientific detachment is still there in his voice, but his movements become more cautious. Russell, typically the more aggressive investigator, actually suggests they maintain current distance and just observe, but Bryce wants closer footage, better thermal imaging, more definitive evidence. They advance. The thermal signature stops moving. On the footage, you can see it turn toward them. Not slowly, not with the uncertain movement of an animal trying to identify a threat. It pivots with purpose, with awareness, and then it starts moving toward them. This is the moment everything changes. Bryce and Russell both freeze. You can hear Russell say something that the audio doesn't quite capture, but his tone is clear. Concern. Real concern from a man who doesn't scare easily. Bryce is still filming, still documenting, but his breathing has changed. Faster, shallower. The figure on thermal gets closer. 150 yards, 100 yards. Moving faster now. And this is where the footage becomes difficult to watch, because you can see the exact moment when both men realize they're not observing anymore. They're being approached, possibly hunted. Russell makes the call. They're backing out. Not running, that might trigger a chase response, but strategic retreat. They start moving backward, keeping the thermal camera trained on the approaching figure. And for a moment, it seems like the plan is working. The figure stops advancing, stands there, visible on thermal, just watching them retreat. Then Bryce steps on something, a branch or root, and stumbles. Not a fall, just a momentary loss of balance. But that's all it takes. The thermal signature explodes into motion, covering the remaining distance at a speed that seems impossible for something that size. And this is where the footage gets chaotic. The camera is pointing at the ground, swinging wildly as Bryce tries to get his footing. You hear Russell shouting, Bryce yelling something unintelligible, and then a sound that doesn't belong to either man. A vocalization so loud it distorts the audio recording, so close it seems impossible that whatever made it wasn't directly on top of them. What happens next is captured in fragments. The camera catches glimpses of something massive moving past Bryce. The thermal imaging shows a heat signature at extremely close range, details visible that weren't clear before, and then impact. Something hits Bryce hard enough that he goes down. The camera flies from his hand, landing at an angle that captures both men and the space around them. For 11 seconds, you can see it. The figure, not clearly, the lighting is terrible and everything is moving, but enough to understand this isn't a bear, isn't a person in a suit, isn't anything that Bryce, with 15 years of wildlife biology experience, can easily categorize. It's massive, it's fast, and it's directly engaged with them in a way that suggests territorial defense or aggression. Then the camera cuts out. Later investigation revealed the battery was dislodged on impact. When footage resumes 11 minutes later, Bryce is on the ground, conscious but clearly injured. Russell is on the radio calling for Mireya to bring medical supplies, and whatever attacked them is gone, vanished back into the forest as suddenly as it appeared. But here's the detail that makes this more than just a scary encounter. The detail that elevated this from compelling television to genuine evidence that something happened. Bryce wasn't just shaken. He was physically injured in a way that required documentation and medical treatment. And those injuries tell a story that's difficult to explain away. When Mireya reached Bryce and Russell with the medical kit, her first priority was assessing injuries. Bryce Bryce was conscious, alert, but clearly in pain. His left shoulder was damaged, later diagnosed as a partial dislocation that required professional medical treatment. But that wasn't what concerned Maria most. It was the marks on Bryce's back. Through his torn shirt, visible even in the poor lighting, were what appeared to be impact marks, not scratches or claw marks, which would suggest a bear or mountain lion attack. Impact bruising. 5 distinct points of pressure, arranged in a pattern that suggested a hand. A very large hand with fingers that left bruises through heavy outdoor clothing. The team documented everything. Photos from multiple angles, measurements of the bruise pattern, video of Bryce describing what he felt during the encounter. This wasn't dramatization for television. This was evidence collection following protocols that would hold up to scientific scrutiny, because all of them understood the significance of what they were documenting. The medical examination that followed, conducted by a physician in the nearest town who was briefed on the circumstances, revealed the extent of the injuries. The shoulder dislocation was consistent with being grabbed forcefully and pushed or thrown. The bruising pattern showed impact force significant enough to cause deep tissue damage through multiple layers of clothing, and the arrangement of the marks suggested a grip, not an impact from a fall or collision with an object. The doctor, speaking off the record, said the injury pattern was unusual. In his 15 years treating outdoor recreation injuries, hiking accidents, wildlife encounters, he'd seen plenty of bear attacks, mountain lion encounters, falls from climbing. This didn't match any standard pattern. The force required to create those bruises through heavy clothing suggested something very strong, and the hand-like arrangement, if that's what it was, indicated digits significantly larger than human. But physical injuries were only part of the evidence. The cameras had been rolling through most of the encounter, and when the team reviewed that footage, analyzing every frame, they found details that were even more disturbing than Bryce's injury. Details that suggested whatever attacked him was more intelligent, more aware than any known North American wildlife. The thermal footage from that night has been analyzed by multiple experts, wildlife biologists, thermal imaging specialists, even primatologists who study great ape behavior. And while interpretations vary, certain details are consistently noted across all analyses. First, the heat signature shows bipedal locomotion that's smoother and more coordinated than what you'd see from a bear walking upright. Bears can stand on hind legs, but their movement in that position is awkward, unstable. This figure moved with fluidity, purpose. The gait suggested an animal designed for bipedal movement, not one temporarily adopting an uncomfortable stance. Second, the speed of approach when Bryce stumbled. One wildlife biologist calculated that based on the distance covered and time elapsed, the figure was moving at approximately 25 miles per hour through dense forest at night. That's fast for any large animal, but especially remarkable for something moving upright through terrain with significant obstacles. Third, and perhaps most significant, is the behavior pattern. The initial approach was measured, almost cautious. The figure moved parallel to the investigators, maintaining distance, observing. This suggests awareness and decision-making. When they tried to close distance, it responded by approaching, but still in a controlled manner. The explosive rush only came after Bryce's stumble, which could be interpreted as a threat response to sudden movement. This behavioral pattern doesn't match standard predator behavior. If this was a bear or mountain lion viewing them as prey, the attack would have come differently. Predators don't usually give warnings or make themselves visible before attack. They use surprise, ambush. The fact that this figure was visible on thermal for minutes before the encounter suggests it wasn't trying to hunt them covertly. Some experts who reviewed the footage suggested the behavior was more consistent with territorial defense. The figure was making itself known, establishing dominance, warning the intruders to leave. When that warning was ignored and the humans continued approaching, it escalated to physical confrontation. But crucially, it didn't continue the attack. Once Bryce was down, once the threat was neutralized, it withdrew. That restraint is significant. If this was a mindless, aggressive animal, you'd expect the attack to continue until the threat was completely eliminated or driven away. Instead, there was what appeared to be a measured response, enough force to establish dominance and remove the perceived threat, but not continued aggression beyond what was necessary. That suggests intelligence, decision-making capacity, possibly even something approaching rational thought. But the most compelling piece of evidence, the detail that still generates debate among researchers, came from the audio analysis. Because when experts isolated and enhanced the vocalization captured during the encounter, they found something that shouldn't exist in North American wildlife. Audio analysis of wildlife vocalizations follows established scientific protocols. You compare the recording against cataloged sounds from known species, analyzing frequency range, duration, complexity, and acoustic structure. Most animal sounds fall into predictable patterns. Even rare or unusual vocalizations can typically be matched to a known species or categorized within a family group. The vocalization captured during Bryce's encounter didn't match anything in the database. Dr. Mireya Mayer, who has extensive experience with primate vocalizations from her years studying lemurs in Madagascar and searching for new species, said it was unlike any ape or monkey call she'd encountered. The frequency range was too broad, starting in the low register that suggested a large chest cavity, then rising to pitches that would require complex vocal structures. Audio specialists brought in to analyze the recording identified multiple concerning details. First, the duration. The vocalization lasted approximately 7 seconds, far longer than typical bear vocalizations or mountain lion screams. Second, the complexity. There were tonal shifts within the call that suggested controlled modulation, not just involuntary sound production. But here's what really disturbed the experts. When they isolated and enhanced the audio, removing background noise and amplifying the primary vocalization, they found what sounded like structure. Not language, nobody is claiming that, but rhythmic elements, patterns within the sound that suggested intentional communication rather than simple emotional expression. One primatologist who reviewed the audio off the record said it reminded him of great ape threat displays. Gorillas, chimpanzees, and orangutans all have specific vocalizations used to establish dominance or warn away threats. This sound had similar elements: loud volume designed to intimidate, prolonged duration to demonstrate capacity, tonal shifts that might convey emotional state or intention. But it was more complex than any known great ape vocalization, suggesting a larger animal with more sophisticated vocal apparatus. The team also captured what happened after the vocalization: silence, complete silence. Even the ambient forest noise that had been present throughout the evening, distant insects, slight wind in trees, disappeared, as if every living thing in that valley stopped making sound when this creature vocalized. That kind of response suggests a recognized apex predator, something that other animals know and fear. Audio evidence alone doesn't prove Bigfoot exists, but combined with the thermal footage, the injury pattern, the behavioral observation, it adds another piece to a puzzle that's becoming increasingly difficult to explain away with conventional wildlife. And that cumulative evidence is what made Bryce's encounter different from hundreds of other Bigfoot sighting claims. The most significant impact of the attack wasn't the physical injuries, though those took weeks to fully heal. It was the psychological and philosophical shift in Bryce Johnson himself. The man who'd spent 3 seasons of Expedition Bigfoot carefully maintaining scientific skepticism was fundamentally changed by 11 minutes in a dark forest. In interviews after the incident, Bryce struggled to articulate what changed. He'd been attacked by wildlife before during his career as a biologist. He'd had close encounters with bears, been charged by elk, dealt with aggressive mountains. Those experiences were frightening in the moment, but ultimately explainable within his understanding of animal behavior. This was different. Bryce described the encounter as facing something that was aware of him in a way that felt almost human. Not the instinctive awareness that animals have of threats or food sources, but conscious recognition. He said it felt like being evaluated, assessed, like whatever was out there was making decisions about him based on observation and analysis, not just reacting instinctively. That sense of being recognized by something unknown shook Bryce's scientific worldview. Because if Bigfoot exists, if there's a large bipedal primate living in North American forest that science hasn't documented, that changes fundamental assumptions about biology, ecology, anthropology, it means we've missed something enormous, that our understanding of what's possible in these environments is incomplete. But more personally, it meant Bryce had to reconsider years of dismissing evidence, explaining away sightings, maintaining that skeptical barrier. He'd looked at thermal footage before and found reasons to doubt, heard vocalizations and suggested more mundane explanations, examined footprints and pointed out inconsistencies. Now he understood that his skepticism, while scientifically appropriate, might have blinded him to something real. His colleagues noticed the change immediately. Mireya said Bryce became more open to possibilities he'd previously dismissed. Russell noted that Bryce stopped automatically looking for conventional explanations and started seriously considering that some evidence might be exactly what it appeared to be, proof of an unknown species. But Bryce was careful not to swing too far in the other direction. He didn't abandon scientific rigor or start accepting every piece of questionable evidence. Instead, he developed what he called informed openness, maintaining standards of proof while acknowledging that his personal experience suggested the standards might actually be met by genuine Bigfoot evidence if examined without predetermined bias. The transformation of Bryce Johnson from skeptic to experiencer represents something significant in Bigfoot research, because experiencers, people who claim direct encounters, are often dismissed by scientists. But when a trained biologist with impeccable credentials and a documented history of skepticism has an encounter, documents it with multiple cameras and instruments, and shows physical injuries consistent with his account, that carries weight. The episode featuring Bryce's attack became one of the most watched in Expedition Bigfoot history, but the response was divided. True believers in Bigfoot's existence saw it as the most compelling evidence ever captured on television. Skeptics raised questions about what the footage actually showed and whether injuries could have other explanations. Online analysis of the thermal footage exploded across social media and Bigfoot research forums, frame-by-frame breakdowns, enhancement attempts, debates about whether the heat signature showed features consistent with an unknown primate or could be explained as a bear. Some argued the movement was too fluid for a bear. Others pointed out that in poor lighting and chaotic circumstances, misidentification was always possible. The injuries became a particular point of controversy. Medical professionals who examined photos of Bryce's bruising noted it was consistent with impact from a large hand, but some argued that falling against a branch or rock formation could create similar patterns. The shoulder dislocation was definitely real, confirmed by X-rays and medical treatment, but its cause remained subject to interpretation. What couldn't be disputed was that something happened. Bryce had real injuries requiring real medical care. Multiple cameras captured footage of something large moving through the forest. Audio recorded vocalizations that experts couldn't definitively attribute to known species. Whether that added up to proof of Bigfoot or an unusually dramatic bear encounter remained debatable, but it wasn't nothing. The production team made a decision that surprised some viewers. They released the raw footage, not just the edited episode version, to allow independent analysis. This included the thermal imaging files in their original format, audio recordings without enhancement, and even the footage from those 11 minutes when the camera was on the ground capturing fragments of the encounter. This transparency was deliberate. The team knew that keeping footage secret would fuel conspiracy theories about editing or manipulation. By releasing everything for independent analysis, they invited scrutiny. Some researchers found additional details in the raw footage that supported the Bigfoot interpretation. Others used the same footage to argue for more conventional explanations. But the conversation was happening based on actual evidence, not speculation about what might be hidden. Bryce himself became more reserved about discussing the encounter in public. He'd give factual accounts of what happened, describe his injury, explain the evidence collected, but he avoided sensationalizing or making definitive claims. When asked directly if he believed he was attacked by Bigfoot, his answer was carefully measured. He experienced something that didn't match his extensive knowledge of North American wildlife, and the evidence collected was consistent with encounter with a large, unknown bipedal creature. Tonight, we're stepping into a story that was never meant to leave the cutting room floor. During filming of Expedition Bigfoot, lead investigator Maria Mayer reportedly captured footage so disturbing that production was halted almost overnight. Memory cards were confiscated, files were locked down, and what was supposed to be just another night in the field turned into a silence that still hasn't been explained. Officially, the network called it a creative pause. Unofficially, insiders describe something far more serious: outside intervention, erased data, and a scientist who suddenly stopped speaking publicly. This isn't just about Bigfoot, and it isn't just about a TV show. It's about what happens when evidence crosses a line someone else has already drawn. Before we break down what was filmed, what vanished, and why this case may never be revisited on television, make sure you're subscribed, because once you hear how deep this goes, you'll understand why this story didn't disappear by accident. What happened during that Expedition Bigfoot shoot didn't begin with panic or chaos. It began quietly, the way most serious investigations do. Late at night, minimal movement, a sense that something was off long before anyone could explain why. The team had worked this terrain before: dense forest, uneven ground, heavy canopy. But that night felt different. Even experienced crew members commented on how the sound seemed muted, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Maria Mayer was leading one of the units, focused, methodical, treating the night like any other data collection operation. Shortly after midnight, thermal readings began showing irregular movement patterns near the tree line. Not random heat signatures, not animals drifting in and out of range. These readings were deliberate, appearing, stopping, repositioning. Mireya initially assumed equipment interference or overlapping wildlife movement, but the patterns didn't match anything in her field experience. When the drone camera was adjusted and locked onto the clearing, the feed briefly stabilized, and then everyone froze. On screen was a tall, upright figure moving with balance and intent, not running, not charging, walking. Its heat signature was unusually intense, brighter than surrounding wildlife, yet oddly controlled. The figure paused near the edge of the clearing, partially obscured by trees, and turned its head toward the drone. That moment lasted only seconds, but it was enough. Enough for silence to fall across the monitoring tent. Enough for someone to whisper, "That's not supposed to be there." Then the feed dropped. No warning, no gradual signal loss. 1 second it was there, the next it was gone. Static replaced video. Audio spiked, then cut entirely. When the systems rebooted, timestamps had jumped forward several minutes. No one remembered giving commands. No one recalled moving. The gap couldn't be explained. Mireya immediately ordered all local backups secured. She wanted the data preserved before anyone could touch it. That's when the first red flag appeared. The drone's onboard storage still held fragments of the encounter. Incomplete, distorted, but undeniably real. Enough to confirm the figure wasn't a visual artifact or misread thermal bloom. Within hours before sunrise, production leadership was contacted by higher-level executives. By midday, the tone had changed completely. What had started as a routine expedition was now being treated as a liability, not because it was fake, but because it wasn't. By morning, the atmosphere around the expedition had changed completely. What should have been a routine data review turned into closed-door conversations and unanswered questions. Mireya expected scientific scrutiny, verification. What she didn't expect was silence. Calls went unreturned. Messages were acknowledged without answers. And when production leadership finally spoke, it wasn't about the footage itself. It was about procedure. The first instruction came quietly. Halt all filming until further notice. No explanation, no timeline, just stop. Equipment was powered down, drones grounded, and memory cards cataloged for temporary review. Mireya pushed back, insisting that any biological anomaly fell under her scientific jurisdiction. The response was short and unsettling. This was no longer an editorial decision. It was administrative. Less than 24 hours later, unfamiliar personnel arrived at the field base. They didn't wear network branding. They didn't introduce themselves as producers. They carried hard cases, clipboards, and spoke in precise, rehearsed language. Their request wasn't framed as optional. All recording media was to be surrendered immediately. Drones, camera cards, audio logs, even personal backups. One crew member later said it felt less like a production pause and more like a controlled sweep. Mireya objected openly. She demanded to know who authorized the confiscation and where the data would be taken. One of the men responded without raising his voice. "This material is no longer cleared for broadcast or independent analysis." That sentence ended the discussion. From that moment on, nothing belonged to the team. By that evening, digital access began disappearing. Cloud folders were locked, editing systems flagged errors. An audio engineer reported his laptop rebooting mid-session, returning with files missing and permissions revoked. Another crew member noticed timestamps altered on backups they hadn't touched. The data wasn't just being collected, it was being rewritten. Officially, the network would later describe the shutdown as a technical issue paired with creative reassessment, but those on site knew better. You don't erase footage this aggressively unless someone is afraid of what it shows. And as Mireya stood in a clearing that was now silent again, one truth became impossible to ignore. The investigation hadn't ended. It had been taken over. For a brief window of time, everyone believed the evidence was gone for good. The confiscated drives, the wiped systems, the locked folders, it all seemed airtight. Whatever had been captured that night had been swallowed by corporate silence. And yet, something survived. Not a full video. Not a clean backup, just a fragment that wasn't supposed to be there at all. Days after the shutdown, a former assistant editor, someone low enough in the hierarchy to be overlooked, discovered a cached still frame buried deep inside a temporary render folder. It hadn't been flagged, hadn't been encrypted, and hadn't been scrubbed during the purge. One single image, automatically generated during a background process before access was revoked. A digital ghost. The frame showed a clearing choked with fog, trees barely visible at the edges. In the center stood a tall, upright shape. Its proportions were wrong in a way that was immediately unsettling. The shoulders were too wide. The arms hung too long. The head sloped back at an angle that didn't match human anatomy, yet the stance was unmistakably bipedal. It wasn't caught mid-run or mid-attack. It was standing still, watching. What disturbed those who saw it most wasn't the shape itself. It was the posture. The figure wasn't reacting to the camera. It wasn't startled. Its head was slightly tilted, as if assessing the equipment observing it. As if it understood it was being watched and had chosen not to hide. The editor shared the frame privately with 2 trusted colleagues. Within hours, it had been copied, renamed, and passed along through encrypted messages. Then something strange happened. The file began disappearing from devices without being deleted. One recipient swore it vanished while he was looking at it. Another found the file name still present, but the data inside reduced to 0 bytes. It was as if the image was being hunted. When the frame briefly surfaced on a closed research forum, it lasted less than 10 minutes before being taken down by an automated copyright claim filed by a company no one recognized. Not the network, not the production company, a third party, one registered to a Virginia address tied to defense contracting offices. That was when the whispers changed. This wasn't damage control. This wasn't embarrassment. This was containment. And the single surviving frame became proof that what Mireya's team encountered wasn't a mistake. It was something, someone else already knew existed. After the frame vanished, attention quietly shifted to one person, Mireya Mayer herself. Not publicly, not in headlines, but behind closed doors. Interviews she had already agreed to were suddenly canceled. Academic appearances were postponed without explanation. Even colleagues who had known her for years noticed something was wrong. She stopped answering messages. Calls went to voicemail. Emails received polite, delayed replies that said nothing at all. To the public, it looked like a routine break. To those close to her, it felt forced. One production assistant later recalled that Mireya had confided in him days after the shutdown. She said she'd been warned, not threatened directly, but advised, that discussing the footage could have serious consequences. Not professional consequences, legal ones, national ones. She was told the material fell outside normal scientific discovery and into a category she wasn't authorized to address. When she asked who made that determination, she was given no names, only an instruction: stop. Things escalated quickly. A scheduled university lecture on undiscovered primates was abruptly pulled from the calendar hours before it was set to begin. Event staff said 2 men had arrived early, requesting a private conversation with her. Witnesses described Mireya leaving the building with them, visibly shaken. The lecture never happened. No explanation was given. When she finally reappeared publicly, it was in a short, heavily edited network video. Calm lighting, neutral background, controlled tone. She stated that no verifiable evidence had been found and that the investigation had yielded inconclusive results. Viewers immediately noticed how unlike her it felt. Her cadence was stiff. Her eyes drifted off camera repeatedly. Audio specialists later noted faint compression artifacts suggesting the video had been altered before release. Behind the scenes, crew members said she was furious, not afraid. She believed the footage represented a genuine biological anomaly and deserved scientific review. But every path forward was blocked. Journals wouldn't respond. Conferences declined submissions. Even private discussions seemed to disappear before they started. The message was clear without being spoken. Mireya could continue her career, as long as she pretended that night never happened, and the fact that a respected scientist was silenced so efficiently told everyone else something terrifying. Whatever had stepped into that clearing wasn't just unknown, it was protected. After Mireya Mayer's silence became impossible to ignore, the rest of the Expedition Bigfoot team began to notice changes that went far beyond a canceled shoot. It wasn't just the footage that disappeared. The paper trail vanished with it. Call logs were missing. Emails referencing the incident returned error messages. Even internal production documents were quietly rewritten, removing entire dates from the schedule as if that expedition had never occurred. Crew members who tried to talk about the incident informally were warned to stop asking questions, not by executives they recognized, but by legal representatives they'd never interacted with before. New non-disclosure agreements were issued far stricter than anything previously signed. These didn't just restrict discussion of unaired content, they prohibited referencing field anomalies, third-party intervention, and external oversight. Language that had no place in a normal television contract. Then the personal incident started. One cameraman reported a break-in at his home. Nothing valuable was taken. No electronics, no cache. The only thing missing was a small external hard drive he used for off-site backups. A sound engineer received a late-night call from an unknown number. The voice on the other end didn't threaten him. It simply said, "You already gave us what we needed," and hung up. Another crew member claimed his editing laptop locked itself during a routine session, displaying a message that read, "Access revoked by administrator." At first, some tried to explain it away as paranoia, stress, coincidence, but the pattern was impossible to ignore. Everyone affected had been present during the night of the encounter. Everyone else was left alone. A small group of crew members decided to quietly compare notes, not over email, not over phones, in person. They met in a motel outside Portland under the excuse of a production debrief. What they discovered confirmed their worst fear. They weren't dealing with a network cleanup. They were dealing with coordinated suppression. Fragments of data still existed: corrupted audio logs, partial telemetry, thermal readings that showed multiple large heat signatures circling the camp hours before the sighting. These weren't random movements. They flanked the team, advanced, with intent. That was the moment the crew understood the truth. Expedition Bigfoot hadn't crossed into dangerous territory by accident. They had walked into something that already had watchers, and those watchers were now watching them. When the remaining crew quietly began comparing what little data they still had, a disturbing picture started to form. This wasn't just about a single figure caught on thermal for a few seconds. The encounter was only the most visible moment in a pattern that had been building long before that night. Recovered telemetry from the drone showed repeated signal interference beginning hours earlier, not random static, not environmental noise. The interference appeared in timed bursts, always lasting the same duration, always occurring when the drone crossed specific points in the airspace. When one technician overlaid those interference points on a topographical map, something chilling emerged. The disruptions formed a loose perimeter around the team's camp, almost like a boundary. Thermal logs painted an even stranger picture. Multiple heat signatures appeared intermittently around the perimeter throughout the night. They didn't behave like animals. They didn't roam. They didn't chase prey. They moved in short, controlled paths, stopping and starting as if reacting to something unseen. At one point, 3 signatures converged near the tree line, merged into a single heat mass, then separated again minutes later. No known wildlife pattern matched that behavior. Audio fragments recovered from corrupted files revealed low-frequency pulses embedded beneath normal ambient sound. Most viewers would never notice them, but when isolated and slowed down, the pulses followed a precise rhythm. Every 13 seconds, repeating, consistent. Audio engineers noted that the frequency range didn't align with wind, insects, machinery, or known animal calls. It also didn't behave like random interference. It behaved like signaling. One technician made a connection that stopped the room cold. The pulse interval matched communication timing used in certain long-range tracking systems. Not civilian, military, experimental. That didn't mean the sound was man-made, but it suggested something operating with structure, not instinct. Even more unsettling was what happened when the team tried to reprocess the data. Files that should have been recoverable degraded further each time they were open, as if repeated access caused decay. One engineer described it as the data-resisting analysis. Whether that was a technical anomaly or something else, no one could say. By the end of that meeting, the crew reached an unspoken agreement. The footage wasn't erased because it was confusing. It was erased because it was coherent. It showed intent, awareness, and coordination. And whatever they encountered wasn't reacting like an animal being discovered. It was reacting like something that already knew it was being observed and allowed itself to be seen. By the time the crew finished assembling what little data remained, one reality had become impossible to ignore. There was no safe way forward. Not scientifically, not legally, and not personally. Whatever Expedition Bigfoot had stumbled into wasn't something that could be revisited, debated, or slowly unpacked over future seasons. The cost of continuing had already become clear. Attempts to escalate the findings through proper scientific channels quietly failed. Emails to research institutions went unanswered. Informal conversations with colleagues ended abruptly once the topic was raised. One crew member later admitted that a longtime academic contact warned him off record to stop pursuing the material entirely. This isn't a discovery, he was told. It's a boundary. At the network level, the shift was just as stark. Show outlines that once encouraged deeper investigation were rewritten to remove anything resembling direct encounters. Language was softened. Stakes were reduced. The emphasis moved away from evidence evidence and toward atmosphere, not because the producers wanted it that way, but because that was the only version still allowed to exist. Privately, some team members discussed walking away altogether. They had families, careers, lives that suddenly felt exposed. The realization that unknown parties could access personal devices, track movements, and erase data without explanation changed how everyone viewed their role. This wasn't about fear of ridicule, it was fear of attention. The most telling moment came when one crew member asked a simple question during a closed production call. If this isn't real, why are we being treated like it is? No one answered. The truth was never officially denied. It was simply made unreachable. And so the investigation didn't end with a conclusion. It ended with containment. The show continued, but the story didn't. Viewers never saw the moment that changed everything, never heard the sounds buried beneath the audio, never saw the frame that shouldn't exist. All that remained was absence, a gap in the narrative that felt heavier than any on-screen reveal. By choosing silence, the people in control made one thing clear. Whatever stepped into that clearing wasn't meant to be studied publicly. And the most unsettling possibility wasn't that it existed. It was that someone already knew it did. Long after filming stopped and the crew scattered, one question refused to die. Why Mireya Mayer? Of all the people involved, she was the one with the strongest scientific footing, the one most capable of contextualizing what had been seen. And yet, she was also the one who went silent the fastest. That silence wasn't empty. It was loaded. In private conversations with colleagues before cutting off contact, Mireya reportedly made one statement that never left the people who heard it. She didn't say they had found Bigfoot. She didn't say they had found a new species. She said, "What we saw doesn't fit the tree." In biology, the tree is everything. Taxonomy, evolution, lineage. If something doesn't fit, it means it didn't branch naturally from what came before. It means the framework breaks. That idea explains the reaction better than any cover story. A misidentified animal could be debated. A hoax could be dismissed. But something that behaves with coordination, signaling, awareness of surveillance, and physical traits that don't align with known evolutionary paths, that isn't folklore. That's a problem. Mireya understood that going public without absolute control of the narrative would invite ridicule at best and career destruction at worst. But what seemed to stop her wasn't fear of backlash. It was the realization that the evidence didn't belong to science anymore. Once federal contractors appeared, once data was seized under administrative authority, the matter shifted domains. From research to security, from curiosity to containment. One former associate claimed Mireya was offered a choice: continue her work, access funding, maintain credibility, or challenge the decision and lose everything. She chose survival, not silence. There's a difference. Silence implies consent. Survival implies pressure. In the months that followed, she redirected her focus to safer, established research. Publicly, she moved on. Privately, she stopped fieldwork involving remote forests entirely. She never corrected the official explanation, but she never fully endorsed it either. Sometimes the loudest warning isn't spoken. It's when someone who spent their life chasing the unknown suddenly decides there are things that should not be followed again. Years have passed, but the absence left by that night still lingers. The missing footage was never recovered, the encounter was never acknowledged, and Expedition Bigfoot quietly moved on without ever explaining what changed. But silence doesn't erase impact. It preserves it. What makes this case unsettling isn't just the possibility that something unknown was filmed. It's the response, the speed, the precision, the authority with which evidence was removed and people were silenced. Those actions don't follow curiosity. They follow familiarity. If what Mireya Mayer's team encountered was harmless, it wouldn't require containment. If it was imaginary, it wouldn't demand erasure. And if it was misunderstood wildlife, it wouldn't trigger outside intervention at all. The most disturbing possibility is also the simplest. Whatever stepped into that clearing had been seen before, documented before, studied before, and carefully kept out of public reach. And that leaves one final question. Not about Bigfoot, not about television, but about us. If something like this can be hidden so completely, how much else have we already been taught not to see? A banned episode of Expedition Bigfoot has surfaced after years of being deliberately hidden from the public, and what it contains is unlike anything this show has ever produced. The footage was pulled before it ever aired, and the people closest to it have been silent ever since. Tonight we break down exactly what was captured, why it was buried, and why it is finally coming to light. If you are new here, Subscribe now because this is one you cannot afford to miss. Expedition Bigfoot was never like the other shows. From the moment it premiered on the Travel Channel, it separated itself from every other Bigfoot program that had come before it by doing something none of them had ever seriously attempted. It treated the search for Bigfoot as a legitimate scientific investigation, not a campfire ghost story, not a group of enthusiasts wandering through the woods with flashlights and night vision cameras hoping to get lucky. A real, structured, methodical investigation backed by technology that most research institutions could only dream of having access to in the field. The team they assembled reflected that intention from the very beginning. Mireya Mayer brought decades of field primatology to the expedition. Ronnie LeBlanc came in with years of on-the-ground research and a deep understanding of Bigfoot behavior patterns across North America. Russell Accord brought survivalist expertise and a no-nonsense approach to evidence collection that kept the team grounded when things got strange. And Dr. Mireya Mayer's scientific background gave the entire operation a credibility that the Bigfoot research community had been starving for. Together they used military-grade thermal imaging, acoustic monitoring arrays, predictive behavioral algorithms, and DNA collection protocols that mirrored those used in mainstream wildlife research. The results they produced in their early seasons were compelling enough to attract serious attention from people outside the typical paranormal audience. Biologists, wildlife researchers, former military personnel with backgrounds in tracking and surveillance. People who would never have tuned into a standard cryptid hunting show were watching Expedition Bigfoot and taking it seriously. That reputation made what happened next all the more significant, because when a show that has worked that hard to establish scientific credibility suddenly pulls an entire episode without explanation and scrubs any reference to it from their promotional materials and episode guides, the silence itself becomes a story. The network said nothing officially. The production company said nothing. The cast said nothing. An episode that should have aired simply did not, and the space it left behind was filled with questions that nobody in an official capacity was willing to answer. That silence has lasted for years. Until now. The banned episode was filmed during what multiple sources close to the production have described as the most intense and unsettling expedition the Expedition Bigfoot team had ever undertaken. The location was deep in the Pacific Northwest in a stretch of wilderness that the team's behavioral analysis software had flagged as one of the highest probability zones for Bigfoot activity on the entire continent. The algorithm they used cross-referenced historical sighting reports, terrain mapping, food source availability, water proximity, and seasonal migration patterns to identify corridors where the likelihood of an encounter was statistically significant. This particular location had scored higher than anywhere they had ever investigated before, and the production team made the decision to commit significant resources to the expedition as a result. They brought in additional equipment. They extended the planned timeline in the field. They brought in a consulting scientist who had not appeared on the show before and whose involvement was never publicly announced or credited. By all accounts, the early days of the expedition were unremarkable. The team set up base camp, deployed their sensor arrays, and began their standard protocols. But crew members who were present during those first nights have since described an atmosphere on the ground that felt different from anything they had experienced during previous seasons. The forest around the camp was quieter than it should have been. Wildlife that would normally be audible at night was absent. The acoustic monitors picked up low-frequency sound events that did not match any cataloged animal vocalization in the database they were working from. On the third night, a member of the production crew reported seeing a large shape moving at the edge of the tree line that disappeared before anyone else could get eyes on it. By the fourth day, the team's equipment was registering anomalies that nobody could immediately explain. Thermal hits that appeared and vanished before a clean image could be captured. Ground vibrations that the monitoring equipment logged but that nobody on the team could feel directly. A persistent interference pattern affecting two of their communications devices that the technical team was unable to trace to any known source. None of this was unusual enough on its own to alarm an experienced team, but the accumulation of it over such a short period created a tension in the camp that multiple sources have described as palpable. Something about that stretch of wilderness felt aware of their presence in a way that previous locations never had, and on the fifth night, everything changed. What the cameras captured on that fifth night is the reason this episode was pulled, and the reason everyone connected to it has spent years refusing to discuss it publicly. The thermal imaging unit positioned on the north-facing slope of the ridge above base camp registered a heat signature at approximately 2:17 in the morning that the team's scientist later described in a private communication as the single most significant thermal event ever recorded in the context of Bigfoot research. The signature was bipedal. It was massive. The estimated height based on the imaging data placed the figure at somewhere between 8 and 9 feet tall, with a shoulder width and body mass that ruled out any known North American predator or primate. The figure moved through dense forest at a pace that should have been impossible given the terrain. No stumbling, no hesitation. Fluid, purposeful movement that suggested something completely at home in an environment that would have challenged even an experienced human tracker moving in daylight. The thermal footage ran for 4 minutes and 38 seconds before the figure moved out of the sensor's range. In the final 40 seconds of that footage, a second heat signature appeared on the opposite side of the ridge. Smaller than the first, but still well outside the size range of any known animal in the region. It was stationary, positioned at an elevated point with a direct sightline to the base camp below, watching. The team reached the site at first light, and what they found on the ground stopped the expedition in its tracks. A series of ground impressions pressed deep into the soil in a pattern consistent with bipedal locomotion. The stride length between impressions measured at over 5 feet. Branches on the surrounding trees had been broken at a height of between 7 and 8 feet off the ground, in a pattern that suggested something had been moving through the area at speed. And in the soft earth at the base of a large Douglas fir, the team found biological material. Hair, tissue, enough of both to constitute a legitimate sample for DNA analysis. The scientist on site immediately initiated collection protocols. The samples were logged, sealed, and prepared for transport. The footage from the thermal unit was reviewed by the full team that morning, and according to every account of that viewing, the reaction in the room was one of complete and total silence. Nobody had words for what they were looking at, because what they were looking at did not fit any category they had been trained to work within, and that was only the beginning of the problem. The biological material collected at the site that morning was unlike anything the Expedition Bigfoot team had previously recovered during their time in the field. The hair samples were long, coarse, and dark, with a thickness and texture that the collecting scientist noted immediately did not match any North American mammal in the reference catalog she was working from. The tissue sample was small, but intact enough to be considered viable for full genetic sequencing. Standard protocol required the samples to be transported to a certified laboratory within a specific window to preserve their integrity, and the team moved quickly to ensure that window was met. The samples left the field site within hours of collection and were transferred through a chain of custody that was documented at every step. The first laboratory to receive the material was a private facility with experience handling wildlife DNA analysis for both commercial and government clients. The initial processing took several days. When the preliminary results came back, the lead analyst on the case requested an internal review before releasing any findings to the production team. That request for an internal review was the first sign that something in the data was not straightforward. When the results were finally shared with the Expedition Bigfoot team, the language used to describe them was careful and heavily qualified. The genetic profile extracted from the samples did not match any species currently cataloged in the reference databases available to the laboratory. It shared certain markers with known primate genetic sequences, but the overall profile was sufficiently distinct that no confident taxonomic identification could be made. In plain terms, the DNA did not belong to anything science had formally documented. The production team requested that the samples be sent to a second independent laboratory for verification, without disclosing the findings from the first analysis. The second laboratory conducted its own sequencing independently and reached a conclusion that mirrored the first. Unknown genetic profile. Primate adjacent markers, no match to any cataloged species. When the two sets of results were placed side by side and reviewed together, the scientist who had been brought in as a consultant reportedly went quiet for a long time before saying anything. What she eventually said was not captured on camera, but the people in that room when she said it have described the moment as the point where the atmosphere of the entire production shifted permanently. The question was no longer whether something had been on that ridge. The question was what that something was and what the existence of its DNA in a verified laboratory report was going to mean for everyone involved. The answer to that question came faster than anyone expected, and it did not come from the science. The timeline between the completion of the banned episode and its disappearance from the broadcast schedule is short. and the sequence of events within that timeline tells a story that is difficult to interpret as anything other than a deliberate and coordinated suppression. The episode was fully edited and delivered to the network in the standard post-production window. It was assigned an air date. Promotional materials were prepared, and then within a period of less than 2 weeks, everything stopped. The air date was quietly removed from the schedule. The promotional materials were pulled. Any reference to the episode in internal communications was systematically scrubbed. People who worked in the production office during that period have described a sudden and complete change in the energy surrounding the show. Conversations that had been open and enthusiastic became closed and careful. Certain topics became off-limits in ways that were never formally stated but were understood by everyone in the room. The cast members were not given a detailed explanation for why the episode was being shelved. They were told it was a production decision, that it was being reviewed, that more information would be provided when available. More information was never provided. What was provided instead were new non-disclosure agreements. Members of the production team who had been present during the filming of the banned episode and during the subsequent DNA analysis process were contacted individually and asked to sign updated legal documents that significantly expanded the scope of what they were prohibited from discussing publicly. The legal language in those documents was described by one former crew member as far more aggressive than anything they had encountered in a standard entertainment industry NDA. It covered not just the footage and the findings, but any conversations, observations, or personal impressions related to the expedition in question. The involvement of outside parties in the decision to pull the episode has never been officially confirmed, but the circumstantial evidence pointing in that direction is substantial. The speed with which legal documents were prepared and distributed suggests that the process was initiated by someone with significant resources and a clear sense of urgency. The network itself has never publicly addressed the missing episode. When pressed by fans and researchers in the years since its disappearance, the standard response has been a variation of no comment or a flat denial that any such episode exists. That denial has only deepened the suspicion of the research community, because the evidence that the episode was filmed, completed, and scheduled is substantial enough that the denial itself requires a level of institutional commitment that goes well beyond standard content management decisions. Something or someone wanted this buried, and they had the reach and the resources to make it happen. In the years since the banned episode disappeared from the broadcast schedule, a small number of individuals connected to the production have attempted to bring what they knew into the public domain. None of them got very far. The pattern that emerges when you look at these cases side by side is consistent enough to suggest that the suppression of this information did not end when the episode was shelved. It has been actively maintained ever since. The first credible attempt to go public came approximately 8 months after the episode was pulled. A former crew member who had been present during the filming and the subsequent DNA review began communicating with a researcher in the Bigfoot community who had been publicly asking questions about the missing episode. The initial exchanges were guarded but substantive. The crew member confirmed that the episode existed, that it had been completed, and that what had been captured during the filming was genuine and significant. They agreed to a recorded conversation. 2 days before that conversation was scheduled to take place, the crew member went silent. Their social media accounts were deleted. Attempts to reach them through mutual contacts went unanswered. The researcher who had been in communication with them has since stated publicly that they believe legal pressure was applied in the intervening period, but that they have no direct evidence to confirm it. A second incident occurred roughly 18 months later when a former post-production employee who had worked on the episode during editing made a series of posts on a now deleted account that described specific details of the footage and the DNA findings in terms that were consistent with what other sources had been saying privately. The posts generated significant attention within the Bigfoot research community before being deleted within 48 hours of going up. The account itself was removed shortly after. The former employee has never publicly reappeared under any identifiable name or account. A third and more recent attempt involved a former consultant connected to the laboratory that processed the initial DNA samples. This individual gave a partial interview to an independent researcher in which they confirmed that anomalous results had been produced from samples connected to a wildlife documentary production, but declined to be more specific. When the researcher attempted to follow up for a second conversation, the consultant stated that they had been advised not to continue and ended all communication. Each of these cases follows the same arc: initial contact, partial disclosure, sudden and complete silence. The timing in every instance suggests external intervention rather than a change of heart, and the consistency of the pattern across multiple individuals over multiple years points to something more organized than a network simply hoping an embarrassing production decision would be forgotten. The story of how the banned episode finally began making its way into the public domain is itself a story of patience, persistence, and a single decision made by someone who had apparently reached the end of their willingness to stay quiet. It did not happen all at once. It happened the way these things typically happen when powerful interests are working to contain them, in fragments, across multiple platforms, through channels that were difficult to trace back to a single source. The first piece of verifiable information to surface publicly was not footage at all. It was a description, a detailed written account posted anonymously to a forum frequented by serious Bigfoot researchers that laid out the basic sequence of events from the expedition with a level of specificity that immediately distinguished it from the speculation and rumor that had been circulating for years. Dates, location details, equipment designations, references to specific team dynamics during the filming, the kind of granular detail that could only have come from someone who was actually there. The post was copied and shared widely before it was taken down, and the copies that survived became the foundation on which subsequent investigations were built. Several months after that initial post, a short clip of what was described as thermal footage began circulating through private channels within the research community. The clip was low resolution, apparently captured from a screen rather than exported directly from the original file, but what it showed was consistent with everything that had been described in the anonymous written account: a large bipedal heat signature moving through dense forest. The clip lasted less than 30 seconds, but it was enough to shift the conversation from rumor to something that demanded a more serious response. Attempts to have the clip authenticated were complicated by its quality, but two independent analysts who reviewed it stated that nothing in the footage was inconsistent with a genuine thermal imaging recording and that the signature it showed did not match any known animal. The production company issued a statement in response to the circulating clip that neither confirmed nor denied its authenticity, but described the sharing of proprietary production materials as a potential legal violation. That statement was notable for what it did not say. It did not say the footage was fabricated. It did not say it was from a different production. It addressed the distribution of the material without making any claim about what the material actually was. To many in the research community, that carefully worded non-denial was more revealing than an outright confirmation would have been. In the months that followed, additional details continued to surface through a network of sources that appeared to be coordinating without being directly connected to one another. Descriptions of the DNA findings, accounts of the internal reaction when the results came back, details about the NDA process and the identity of the legal firm involved. The full picture assembled itself slowly, but the direction it pointed was consistent from the beginning. Something real had been captured on that ridge, and the effort to keep it contained was larger and more deliberate than anyone outside the production had previously understood. The response from the broader research community to the surfaced footage and the DNA claims associated with the banned episode has been anything but unified, and that division is itself worth examining closely because it reflects a tension that has existed within the Bigfoot research world for as long as the field has existed. On one side are the researchers and investigators who look at the totality of what has surfaced and conclude that the evidence is too specific, too consistent, and too corroborated across too many independent sources to be dismissed. These are not fringe voices. Several of the individuals who have spoken most forcefully about the credibility of the banned episode material have decades of field experience and academic credentials that would earn them a hearing in any serious scientific context. Their argument is straightforward. The thermal footage is consistent with previous high-credibility Bigfoot thermal events in terms of size, movement pattern, and heat signature distribution. The DNA findings, while extraordinary, follow a pattern that has appeared in previous serious Bigfoot DNA investigations, where samples produce genetic profiles that could not be matched to any known species. And the behavior of the network and production company in response to the surface material, specifically the careful legal language and the deliberate avoidance of any direct denial, suggests an institutional awareness that the material is genuine and that making false claims about it in a public forum carries legal risk. On the other side are researchers and skeptics who believe the entire story has the structure of a sophisticated content strategy rather than a genuine whistleblower situation. Their argument centers on timing and incentive. The surfacing of the footage and the steady drip of corroborating detail creates exactly the kind of sustained audience engagement that benefits a production looking to generate interest in a new season or a streaming deal. The anonymity of the primary sources makes independent verification impossible, and the DNA claims, while compelling in their specificity, cannot be evaluated directly because the samples and the laboratory reports have never been made available for independent review. What remains when you strip away both the belief and the skepticism is a set of questions that the available evidence cannot yet answer definitively. Was what was captured on that ridge a genuine Bigfoot encounter of a magnitude that has never been documented on camera before? Was the suppression of the episode a response to genuine scientific findings that powerful interests could not afford to become public? Or is the entire arc of this story, from the filming to the burial to the surfacing of the footage, something that was shaped at every stage by hands more interested in audience metrics than in the truth? The honest answer is that nobody outside a very small circle of people knows for certain, and that circle has been remarkably effective at staying quiet. The banned episode still exists somewhere, and the people who know the truth are running out of reasons to stay quiet. NDAs do not last forever, and the pressure on the network to address this story is growing by the day. The research community is not letting this go. More details are surfacing, and the full footage is closer to the public than it has ever been. The only question left is who breaks first. And when they do, nothing will ever be the same for this show or this investigation. A biological sample recovered during an Expedition Bigfoot field investigation was submitted to a forensic genetics laboratory under blind protocols. The lab did not know what they were testing. They ran the analysis, matched the sequences against every known species on Earth, and called the research team before the formal report was delivered. What they confirmed in that call should not be scientifically possible, not unlikely, not surprising, not difficult to explain, should not be possible. Subscribe and stay until the very end, because the results are in this video. Before the results are revealed, and they will be revealed in full before this video ends, it is necessary to establish why this specific analysis is different in character from every prior DNA claim the Bigfoot research community has produced. Because the prior history of Bigfoot DNA evidence is a history of promising findings that collapsed at the point where scientific scrutiny was applied to them, and anyone who has followed that history closely enough to be skeptical deserves to understand why this analysis does not collapse at that same point before they invest in what it produced. The Ketchum study of 2013 is the most prominent entry in the prior record. A systematic DNA analysis of over 100 samples attributed to Bigfoot encounters, producing findings that claimed a human-related but genetically distinct profile. Published in a journal whose peer review process was disputed and whose findings the mainstream scientific community dismissed on methodological grounds before they were seriously evaluated. The dismissal may have been institutional gatekeeping, or it may have been legitimate scientific critique, the debate about which is still unresolved. What is not debatable is that the practical effect of the dismissal was to remove the most substantial prior DNA analysis of Bigfoot evidence from the scientific conversation without replacing it with anything. Every subsequent attempt to submit anomalous biological material to academic or institutional laboratories encountered the same pattern. Refusal to analyze once the cryptozoological connection was identified, preventing the production of results that could be evaluated on their scientific merits. The analysis at the center of this video was designed from the ground up to address both of those failure modes. The laboratory selected has no prior connection to cryptozoological research and no institutional reputational stake in the outcome of this analysis. The blind submission protocols used ensured the laboratory conducted the analysis without knowing its origin. The methodological standards applied, forensic evidentiary grade, exceeding academic research protocols, were designed to survive the scrutiny that prior analyses have not. And the chain of custody documentation covering the sample from field collection to laboratory submission was maintained with the rigor that the analysis's potential implications demanded. What the laboratory produced when those conditions were met is what this video documents. Stay with this, because the results do not arrive until part 5. Everything before that is why the results mean what they mean. And you need that foundation before the results land. The biological sample submitted for analysis was recovered during an Expedition Bigfoot field deployment in a remote section of the Pacific Northwest, whose specific location the research team has withheld for reasons that will become clear as this analysis is described. The deployment was not a standard investigation session. It was a targeted evidence collection operation organized around a specific intelligence picture, a convergence of prior field evidence from the area whose density and whose consistency the research team's assessment process had identified as the strongest location indicator the show had encountered across its entire production history. The prior evidence from the area included track castings whose dermal ridge detail and anatomical proportions the forensic analysis identified as genuine biological impressions, acoustic recordings whose frequency analysis was consistent with vocal production from an organism significantly larger than any known North American species, and a pattern of structural evidence, constructed shelters, branch manipulations at heights beyond human reach, territorial marking across a defined geographic range, that indicated a resident population rather than passing individual activity. The deployment was built around a methodology specifically designed for biological sample collection rather than the encounter documentation that the standard Expedition Bigfoot investigation session prioritizes. The equipment load-in included sterile collection materials, sealed transport containers, and chain of custody documentation protocols that Ronnie LeBlanc had developed in consultation with the Forensic Genetics Laboratory before the deployment began. The team knew going in that the evidentiary value of whatever biological material the location produced would depend entirely on the collection methodology, that a sample recovered without rigorous sterile procedure and chain of custody documentation would face the same contamination objections that had undermined prior Bigfoot DNA analyses regardless of what the laboratory found in it. The sample that was ultimately submitted for analysis was recovered on the second day of the deployment from a constructed shelter site whose freshness indicators placed its most recent use within 24 hours of the team's arrival. Dr. Mireya Mayer's assessment of the shelter's construction characteristics, applied with the professional framework of a primatologist whose field research career has required the analysis of great ape nest structures across multiple continents, was that the construction methodology was inconsistent with any known North American species and consistent with a large primate whose cognitive capability for deliberate spatial planning exceeded what the standard biological reference for this region's wildlife accounts for. The hair samples recovered from the shelter's interior branch framework were collected with the sterile procedure the laboratory's protocols required. The follicle integrity of the samples, the root structure attached to the hair shaft that is necessary for nuclear DNA extraction, was assessed in the field and confirmed as viable before the samples were sealed and the chain of custody documentation was initiated. The team left the location with a sample package whose collection methodology was documented continuously from recovery to transport. What the laboratory found in that package is why this video exists. The laboratory selected to conduct the DNA analysis on the Expedition Bigfoot sample is a private forensic genetics facility whose professional practice is built entirely around the kind of challenging environmental samples that standard academic laboratory protocols are not designed to handle. Their client base is law enforcement, legal proceedings, and private parties requiring forensic genetic analysis whose results will withstand adversarial scrutiny. Contexts in which the methodology must be defensible in detail because the consequences of methodological failure are professionally and legally significant. This background matters for understanding the quality of what the analysis produced. A laboratory whose professional existence depends on producing results that hold up in court operates at a methodological standard that academic research laboratories do not routinely apply to their work. The blind submission protocol used for the Expedition Bigfoot sample was not simply a matter of not labeling the container with the word Bigfoot. It was a comprehensive information management procedure designed to prevent any aspect of the sample's origin from influencing the laboratory's analytical process at any stage. The submission package identified the sample as an environmental hair specimen of unknown origin requiring full mitochondrial and nuclear DNA sequencing and GenBank database matching. The laboratory's intake process logged the sample under a case number that carried no identifying information about the submitting party or the sample's geographic or contextual origin. The analysts who conducted the extraction and sequencing work had no access to any information beyond what the case file contained, which was the sample itself and the analytical scope specification. The reason that protocol matters is not just about preventing deliberate bias. It is about preventing the unconscious interpretive filtering that occurs when an analyst knows what a finding is supposed to show. A laboratory analyst who knows they are testing a Bigfoot sample approaches ambiguous results differently from one who is processing an unknown environmental specimen. The blind protocol ensures ensured that the results the laboratory produced were produced by people who had no expectation about what those results should contain. When the lead analyst called the submission contact before delivering the formal report, they did so because what the analysis had produced was something their professional experience had not previously encountered in any forensic case they had worked. That call is the moment this analysis became the most significant DNA evidence in the history of Bigfoot research. Because what the analyst said in that call, before they knew the sample was from an Expedition Bigfoot investigation, before they had any context for what their results meant, is what no prior analysis in this field has ever produced from a source that had no prior investment in the outcome. Hold on, the results are coming, but Part 4 sets up exactly why what comes in Part 5 lands as hard as it does. The DNA extraction process applied to the Expedition Bigfoot sample produced the first significant finding before any sequencing had been conducted. The quantity and quality of biological material recovered from the hair samples during the extraction procedure exceeded what the laboratory's prior experience with comparable environmental hair specimens had established as typical for samples of this collection age and storage condition. Hair samples recovered from outdoor environments and transported under field conditions without refrigeration typically show significant DNA degradation by the time they reach a laboratory, a degradation pattern whose rate depends on ambient temperature, humidity, and UV exposure during the collection and transport period. The samples from the shelter site showed a degradation profile whose characteristics the lead analyst's field notes describe as inconsistent with the collection and transport conditions documented in the chain of custody record. The DNA was better preserved than the conditions should have produced. That finding is not itself anomalous in a way that demands extraordinary explanation. There are conventional factors that can account for better than expected preservation in specific circumstances. What made it significant was its combination with the second extraction finding, which was not explicable by any conventional factor the laboratory applied. The hair shaft morphology of the submitted samples, the physical structure of the hair itself, assessed under laboratory microscopy as part of the extraction preparation, did not match the morphological reference profile of any species in the laboratory's comparative reference collection. Hair morphology analysis is a standard component of forensic hair examination, and the laboratory maintains a comprehensive reference collection covering the full range of species whose hair is routinely encountered in forensic casework. Human hair has specific morphological characteristics. Each animal species has specific characteristics. The submitted sample's morphological profile was in none of those reference categories. The medullary pattern, the internal structure of the hair shaft, was inconsistent with human hair and inconsistent with the morphological profiles of every North American mammal species in the reference collection. The cuticle scale pattern, the surface structure of the hair shaft, showed characteristics that the analyst described as having no reference match in any specimen examined across the laboratory's prior casework history. Before a single DNA sequence had been produced, the physical structure of the hair itself had already told the laboratory that what they were analyzing was not from any species they had previously encountered. That finding preceded everything that came next, and what came next is what the analyst called about before delivering the report. Part 5, right now. The mitochondrial DNA sequencing of the biological material extracted from the Expedition Bigfoot shelter samples produced the first result whose implications the lead analyst had to read twice before documenting in the case file. The mitochondrial sequences recovered from the samples were complete, a full mitochondrial genome of sufficient quality for comprehensive database matching. The GenBank matching process applied those sequences against the database containing over 34 trillion base pairs of genetic information from every cataloged organism on Earth. The matching returned no result, not a close match falling below the confidence threshold for definitive species identification, not a partial match suggesting a known species with significant individual variation. No match. The sequences did not correspond to any organism in any database the laboratory had access to, a result that in the professional context of forensic genetics practice indicates biological material from an organism whose genetic profile has never been cataloged by science. That result alone would have been significant. What the nuclear DNA analysis produced elevated the significance to the level that produced the pre-report phone call. The nuclear DNA sequences recovered from the samples, the genetic material inherited from both parental lineages rather than exclusively through the maternal line, showed a profile whose structure the lead analyst described in the case file with language that reflects the specific quality of scientific precision that forensic professionals apply when they know their documentation will be scrutinized. The profile was mosaic, Sections of the nuclear sequence were consistent with human genetic material, specifically consistent with sequences present in the human reference genome. Other sections were not. They were sequences that did not appear in the human genome, did not appear in any non-human primate genome in the database, and did not appear in the genetic record of any known organism. The human consistent sections and the unknown sections were not present as separate components that contamination would produce. Two independent genetic profiles overlapping in the same sample. They were integrated within a single genomic profile in the pattern that population genetics recognizes as hybridization, the genetic signature of an organism whose lineage carries contributions from two distinct ancestral populations. One of those ancestral populations was human-related. The other had no reference in the genetic record of life on Earth. That is what the laboratory confirmed. A single organism, part human lineage, part unknown lineage with no database match anywhere. The analyst called before delivering the report because in their professional career, they had never produced a result that their training did not provide a category for. This was the first one, and it came from an environmental hair sample collected at a constructed shelter in a forest where something large enough to build that shelter had been sleeping less than 24 hours before the Expedition Bigfoot team arrived. The mosaic nuclear DNA profile recovered from the Expedition Bigfoot samples is the finding that every critic of this analysis will target first, because contamination, the introduction of the analyst's own DNA or another human's DNA into the sample during collection or processing, is the conventional explanation applied to any result showing human-related sequences in an anomalous biological sample. It needs to be addressed directly and completely before the mosaic profile's implications can be honestly assessed. Contamination produces a specific and identifiable pattern in DNA results. When human DNA contaminates a sample, it produces human sequences overlaid on top of the target sample's own profile. Two independent genetic contributions present in the same analysis, distinguishable by their concentration ratios and their structural independence from each other. Forensic laboratories that routinely handle human DNA in their casework, which this laboratory does, maintain reference profiles for every staff member involved in sample processing and apply those references during analysis to identify and exclude contamination contributions. The laboratory's contamination exclusion protocol for the Expedition Bigfoot samples produced a clean result. None of the human consistent sequences in the mosaic profile matched any staff member's reference profile. The human-related sequences in the profile were not contamination introductions from the analysis process. They were present in the original sample material. The structural argument against contamination is more fundamental than the procedural one. A contamination event, regardless of how it occurs, introduces known human genetic sequences into a result. Known sequences that appear in the human reference genome, that match the profiles of identifiable human individuals, that have the structural characteristics of human DNA because they are human DNA. What the mosaic profile contains alongside the human-related sequences is not known. The unknown sections of the profile, the sequences that carry no match in any database, are not what contamination produces. Contamination produces known sequences from known sources. The unknown sequences in this profile have no known source. They are not human DNA appearing in an unexpected location. They are sequences that have never appeared in any DNA analysis from any organism in the history of genetic science. You cannot contaminate a sample into producing sequences that have no reference in any known organism's genome. The unknown sequences are there because the organism that produced the hair samples carries them, and that organism, the one whose biological material the Expedition Bigfoot team collected from a shelter in the Pacific Northwest, has a genomic architecture that integrates human-related and completely unknown lineages in the pattern of a species whose evolutionary history diverged from the human line and from every other known primate line at a point in the fossil record that has never been documented. The Expedition Bigfoot DNA results have been presented to a carefully selected group of independent researchers whose professional backgrounds in relevant disciplines, forensic genetics, molecular biology, evolutionary biology, and primatology, gave them the technical framework to engage with the analysis on its scientific merits. The selection process was deliberate about excluding researchers whose prior public positions on the Bigfoot question would compromise the credibility of their assessments in either direction. Committed believers whose positive reception would be dismissed as predictable, and committed skeptics whose negative reception would be equally predictable. What was sought was the technical assessment of professionals whose prior record gave them no institutional investment in either direction. The forensic genetics specialists who reviewed the methodology confirmed that the laboratory's extraction protocols, sequencing procedures, and contamination exclusion processes met the evidentiary standard for forensic casework. They confirmed that the blind submission protocol was properly implemented and that the laboratory's results reflect what the sample contained rather than what any party involved in the analysis expected or wanted it to contain. Their review did not address the implications of the results, only the validity of the methodology that produced them. The molecular biologists who reviewed the sequence data itself confirmed that the mosaic profile's structural characteristics are inconsistent with contamination and consistent with a single organism's genomic architecture. Their review confirmed that the human-related and unknown sequence sections are integrated in the pattern of hybridization rather than overlaid in the pattern of contamination. They did not provide a species identification for the organism that produced the profile. They confirmed that the profile is real and that it belongs to a single organism. The evolutionary biologists who reviewed the unknown sequence sections were the most careful and the most significant voices in the external assessment process. Their analysis of the unknown sequence's relationship to known primate genomic architecture produced a divergence timeline estimate, a calculation of how long ago the lineage that contributed the unknown sequences separated from the human-related lineage that contributed the other half of the mosaic profile. That estimate places the divergence at a point in the evolutionary record that predates the appearance of anatomically modern humans by a margin that is inconsistent with any known branch of the human family tree. The lineage contributing the unknown sequences is not a recently diverged human population. It is an ancient and entirely undocumented branch of the primate evolutionary tree whose existence has never appeared in the fossil record, never been represented in any prior genetic analysis, and whose only documentation in the entire scientific record is the mosaic profile recovered from a hair sample collected at a constructed shelter in a Pacific Northwest forest. The academic institutions approached with these findings have not published responses. Their silence is the loudest thing about this entire story. The DNA results do not contradict what the prior seasons documented. They explain it. Every thermal signature whose dimensions exceeded the biological reference range for known North American species now has a biological correlate. There is a species. It has a genome. Its evolutionary history had an enormous span of time to develop the behavioral sophistication, the territorial intelligence, the counter-surveillance capability, the apparent awareness of human investigation methodology that the prior seasons documented without being able to biologically ground. Dr. Mireya Mayer's primatological assessments of the construction evidence now have a subject. Ronnie LeBlanc's years of accumulated field intelligence were pointing at something whose existence the DNA has now formally established. The investigation built the evidence over seasons of rigorous fieldwork until the evidence was dense enough to drive a targeted sample collection that produced biological material whose analysis confirmed what the fieldwork was indicating. That is how science is supposed to work. Expedition Bigfoot did it correctly. And the result is the first formally documented biological evidence for an unknown primate species in North America that the forensic genetic record now contains. A DNA profile that should not exist is now in the forensic genetic record. The missing 411 disappearance pattern now has a biological candidate. The indigenous traditions that described these beings for generations now have a genomic foundation that Western science spent 2 centuries dismissing. The government's documented non-engagement with credible Bigfoot evidence becomes non-engagement with a species whose human-related ancestry raises questions about classification and rights that no agency has demonstrated any appetite for addressing. The Expedition Bigfoot results answer one question, the one that everything else depends on. Is there something out there? A forensic laboratory that processed a blind sample from a Pacific Northwest forest shelter confirmed that there is. It has a genome. It has been building shelters in those forests without appearing in any scientific record until this investigation arrived with the methodology rigorous enough to find it. It is still out there, and the results that confirmed its existence can no longer be made to disappear.
The Expedition Bigfoot team captured the clearest footage in the show's history, a figure moving through the forest with speed, size, and intent no known animal can match. The clip shocked the crew, forced production to halt, and left investigators shaken. Before we break down what really happened, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what the network hasn't aired yet. It started as a routine sweep. Nothing unusual, nothing the Expedition Bigfoot crew hadn't done 100 times before. The team split into two groups, with Bryce monitoring sensors from the tech hub, while Russell and Mireya moved along a narrow ridge dense with fir trees and thick underbrush. Earlier in the day, the drone operator picked up a strange thermal hit, too tall, too wide, and moving too smoothly to be a bear. But the image was distorted, and the team dismissed it as atmospheric interference. No one knew that the same figure would return after dark, and this time it would step into view. Just after 11 p.m., the woods fell silent. Not quieter, silent. Birds stopped calling. Crickets cut off mid-chirp. Even the wind died. Russell whispered into his mic that the air felt charged, the same way lightning builds before a storm. Then, a seismic sensor, placed earlier to track large animal movement, triggered 3 consecutive alerts. Each impact hit harder than the last, spaced in a pattern that suggested deliberate steps. Heavy, slow, calculated. The data coming into Bryce's monitor showed weight far above any known wildlife in the region. Russell signaled the drone pilot to reposition the infrared unit overhead. The drone adjusted, scanning between trees, catching only faint movement. Branches shifting, leaves trembling, but no visible source. Mireya reported feeling watched, her voice tightening as she scanned the tree line with night vision. On a second monitor, Bryce saw something new, a shape breaking the thermal line. Not a blob, not a glitch, a form, upright, broad, moving with intent. Then it happened. Between 2 trees roughly 40 yards from Russell's position, something stepped forward. The camera caught it, fully, cleanly, unmistakably. A massive silhouette, shoulders impossibly wide, head high above the brush line. It moved with a smoothness no heavy animal should have. And then, as if realizing it had been seen, the figure froze. The camera recorded every second. This wasn't another blur. This wasn't a heat distortion. For the first time, the Expedition Bigfoot crew had captured clear footage of something alive and terrifyingly real. Back at the mobile command unit, Bryce Johnson replayed the clip again and again, each time hoping the figure would resolve into something familiar. An elk rising on its hind legs, a hunter caught in night vision, even a bear brushing against a tree. But the more he zoomed in, the more impossible the footage became. The outline was precise, shoulders too squared for any quadruped, arms noticeably long, nearly reaching to the knees. The stride length measured at almost 4 feet. No animal in the region matched these proportions, not even close. Russell returned to base camp first, visibly shaken. He didn't speak until Bryce turned the monitor toward him. When he saw the paused frame, an enormous silhouette paused mid-step. Russell exhaled hard and whispered, "That's not a bear." It wasn't fear in his voice. It was recognition, like a tracker finally confirming the creature behind the prints he'd followed for years. Mireya arrived moments later, and her reaction was even more telling. She leaned in, studying the limb placement, posture, and gait. Her background in primate behavior made the image more disturbing. The figure moved like an ape, but none existed in North America. Not at this size, and not in this terrain. Then they played the audio. A low-frequency rumble, barely audible to human ears, vibrated beneath the footage. It wasn't a growl. It wasn't wind. It was rhythmic, almost like a sub-harmonic vocalization. Mireya's expression changed immediately. Certain primates communicate using low infrasound to assert dominance or signal territorial claims. If this creature was doing the same, it meant one thing. It knew the team was there. The crew's internal chat lit up as the drone operator sent a message. "Look at the eyes!" Bryce hesitated, but zoomed further. When the figure briefly turned its head, 2 small reflective points flashed back at the camera, positioned further apart than any known mammal. This wasn't normal red-eye reflection. It was something else entirely, something suggesting binocular vision designed for tracking. The final moment sealed it. As the figure stepped behind the trees, the thermal signature didn't fade. It burst, as if the creature's body temperature spiked or it exerted sudden force. The reading jumped faster than any natural animal response. For the first time in the show's history, the crew wasn't debating possibilities. They were staring at evidence that should not exist. With the footage confirmed as authentic, the team made the rare decision to pursue in real time. Normally, any clear sighting forced an immediate strategic retreat, but this was different. If they hesitated, the creature would vanish, leaving nothing but another unsolved mystery. Bryce directed Russell and Mireya to move in carefully from opposite angles, hoping to triangulate the creature's path while avoiding direct confrontation. Every step they took was measured, deliberate, and painfully slow. The forest responded almost instantly. As Russell advanced, the underbrush shifted, not violently, but with a rhythm that suggested something large pacing parallel to him. Every time he stopped, the movement stopped as well. Every time he stepped forward, the unseen presence resumed. It was mirroring him, tracking him. The realization tightened his chest, but he pressed on, whispering updates into his mic. Mireya, on a lower slope, reported something equally disturbing. 3 stones landing near her feet, one after another, tossed from an unseen position deeper in the woods. None were thrown with force. They simply dropped into the brush, as if meant as a signal rather than a threat. Primates sometimes use this behavior to warn intruders. The seismic sensors spiked again, this time with a different pattern. Instead of heavy, deliberate steps, the readings now showed short bursts of movement, almost like something darting across the forest floor with unnatural speed. Bryce watched the data scroll across his screen and realized something chilling. The creature wasn't retreating. It was circling, studying the team as they attempted to approach. Thermal scans from the drone overhead confirmed this. Instead of heading away from the investigators, the heat signature looped around the ridge and reappeared behind Russell, close enough that the drone detected direct body heat through the canopy. Russell didn't hear a sound, didn't feel a breath, didn't sense a presence. But the drone operator insisted. Something massive stood in the shadows behind him for nearly 5 seconds before vanishing again. Mireya's situation escalated even faster. Her audio equipment picked up a vocalization, deep, resonant, almost like a throated hum. The sound vibrated through her chest rather than her ears. A frequency felt more than heard. Animals don't vocalize like this, not in the Cascades, not anywhere near this pitch. As she whispered into her mic that she was backing out, her voice shook for the first time in her career. The creature wasn't fleeing from them. It was herding them, studying their moves, guiding their path, and demonstrating intelligence far beyond any known primate. As the creature continued circling the team, Bryce ordered the drone to pull back and widen its radius. The hope was to capture a full-body thermal outline, something clear enough to compare against known species. What the drone recorded instead made Bryce's stomach drop. The heat signature wasn't just large, it fluctuated in a way no animal should. The torso glowed brighter than the limbs, as if the creature's core temperature surged with adrenaline or intention. This wasn't a stable biological pattern. It looked more like controlled bursts of energy. Russell, still moving along the ridge, spotted something unusual ahead. A tree, thick, mature, solid, began to sway. Even though no wind was present, the movement wasn't random. It rocked once, twice, and then bent sharply, like something massive had gripped it. Russell raised his thermal monocular and saw a shape behind the trunk, a tall, upright form leaning against it, partially hidden. The upper body was unmistakable, shoulders that sloped forward, a head that darted slightly, as if checking multiple angles. What happened next was caught by both Russell's camera and the drone above. The creature stepped out, fully, deliberately, into an open patch of forest, illuminated by moonlight. For the first time in Expedition Bigfoot history, the team captured a full, unobstructed silhouette, broad chest, long arms, and a posture too human to be dismissed as an animal. But there was something worse. It stood still, unmoving, as if intentionally presenting itself. It didn't look startled or threatened. It looked aware, observant, almost almost curious. Then the eyes reflected again, not with the dull glow of typical nighttime eye shine, but with a sharp, almost metallic glint. 2 points of light fixed directly on Russell. The camera jittered as Russell instinctively stumbled back. The creature responded instantly. It tilted its head, a slow, deliberate movement, like a predator assessing whether the human in front of it was a threat. The mic on Russell's vest picked up his breathing, rapid and uneven. He whispered that the creature was testing boundaries. Before he could finish the sentence, the figure moved, not with the heavy stomping of a bear, nor the bounding leaps of a deer. It glided, a smooth, controlled motion that covered distance too quickly for its size. In 3 strides, it was out of sight, but the terror didn't end there. As Russell tried to regroup, a loud crack echoed behind him, the unmistakable sound of something snapping a branch thicker than a human forearm. It wasn't a random break, it was a warning, a message, a demonstration of strength. The footage captured everything, and for the first time, the team realized the creature wasn't just avoiding contact, it was managing the encounter, deciding how close the humans could get. Russell's warning crack still echoed when Bryce issued a direct order: fall back to the rendezvous point immediately. The team had enough evidence to review, and the creature's behavior was growing unpredictable, but the forest had other plans. As Russell and Mireia began withdrawing, the seismic sensors triggered again, this time in rapid succession, forming a pattern that mimicked pursuit. Heavy impacts, fast impacts. Something was moving parallel to them, matching their retreat pace. Step for step, Mireia radioed that she could hear breathing. Not her own, not an echo, but a low, guttural exhale coming from the darkness beside the trail. Every time she stopped, it stopped. Every time she moved, it resumed. The audio equipment strapped to her pack captured the sound clearly. It wasn't the breath of a bear or elk. It was too steady, too controlled, and filled with an unmistakable presence of intent. Back at base, Bryce stared at the live drone feed with growing unease. The thermal signature reappeared behind the crew, just 60 yards back, partially obscured by trees. The creature wasn't fleeing anymore. It was shadowing them, tracking their movements with unnerving precision. The drone operator tried to spotlight the figure, but every attempt failed. The creature dipped into coverage the instant the drone adjusted, as if it understood the angles, the blind spots, the limitations of the equipment. Russell whispered that he could feel the ground tremble beside him, not shaking, pulsing, like something massive stepped softly but powerfully in the soil. Then came the moment that rattled the entire team. A rock the size of a baseball arced through the darkness and landed mere feet from Russell's position. This wasn't a stumble or dislodged debris. It was a throw, calculated, accurate, and forceful enough to send a clear message. Bryce called for an emergency extraction route, but the creature's behavior escalated. The thermal feed showed it moving in short bursts, fast, strategic, almost tactical. It would rush forward 30 feet, stop completely, then reposition again. Predators do this when driving prey. The fear shifted into something colder. The creature wasn't reacting to them. It was controlling their path. As the team approached a narrow canyon that led back to camp, the drone captured a moment that made Bryce's voice crack through the radio. The creature stepped into view again, this time at the canyon mouth, blocking the exit for a split second before vanishing into shadow. It wasn't an accident. It was a test, a demonstration of dominance. The message was unmistakable. This is my territory. You leave when I decide. The crew had stumbled into a chase, neither side fully initiated, but one, the creature, fully controlled. When the team finally made it back to camp, shaken and breathless, Bryce immediately ordered the footage uploaded to the command system for a full-frame analysis. This was standard protocol after any major sighting, but within minutes, it became clear that nothing about this night was going to be standard. The moment the clip stabilized on the screen, every person in the room went silent. The figure wasn't just visible, it was defined with musculature, posture, and movement that could not be dismissed as misidentification. The first step was running the video through a motion enhancement algorithm, something typically used to sharpen fast-moving wildlife. But when the program attempted to track the creature's creature's limb movement, the system glitched, dropping frames, redrawing outlines, struggling to classify the figure as anything biologically familiar. The algorithm's species identification function, meant to categorize animals by movement pattern, returned a result the team had never seen before. No match, unknown biped. The second analysis, thermal reconstruction, was even stranger. The creature's core temperature spiked during moments of stillness rather than exertion. This went against every known mammalian response. Bryce rewound the clip to the exact moment the creature tilted its head toward Russell. The thermal reading jumped dramatically, as if the creature's internal temperature responded to awareness or focus. Mireya suggested this could indicate a biological mechanism not yet documented, a way of regulating heat for speed or sensory advantage. Then came the part that made Bryce lean back in his chair, stunned. When he slowed the footage to 1/10 speed, something subtle but unmistakable emerged. The creature's facial shape. The outline showed a pronounced brow ridge, sloped forehead, and a jawline too elongated for a human. But the most disturbing detail was its mouth. As Russell stumbled and gasped, the creature's lips moved, not in a snarl, not in a roar, but in a small, controlled motion that looked almost like mimicry, as if it were imitating the sound of human breathing. The audio track confirmed this. Under Russell's mic feed, buried beneath the forest noise, was a faint exhale that matched his own rhythm, about half a second delayed. Not animalistic, not accidental, intentional, coordinated. The creature wasn't just following them, it was listening, responding, mirroring, a level of behavioral intelligence that pushed the situation into terrifying new territory. When Bryce isolated the eyes, enhancement filters picked up something reflective, not caused by camera glare. A thin, wet sheen, similar to primate tapetum, but positioned differently. The spacing was wider than a gorilla's, but narrower than a moose's. It suggested stereoscopic depth perception, identical to apex predators. The more they slowed the footage, the clearer one conclusion became. This creature wasn't just avoiding detection, it was studying the team, perhaps even assessing them. And for the first time in the show's history, the biggest fear wasn't that they had captured Bigfoot on camera, but that Bigfoot now understood the crew's methods as well. While Bryce and the tech team analyzed the footage frame by frame, Russell and Mireya stepped outside the command unit to collect themselves. The night was still unnaturally quiet, as if the forest had not yet recovered from whatever presence had moved through it. Russell kept glancing toward the tree line, replaying the creature's head tilt in his mind. There was something calculated in that gesture, something that suggested not just awareness, but intention. Mireya, normally the voice of scientific grounding, admitted in a low voice that the creature's behavior matched advanced primate strategies used only when observing another intelligent group. "It wasn't escaping," she whispered. "It was evaluating us." Inside the command unit, the drone operator called Bryce over with shaky urgency. He had gone back through raw drone telemetry, data that wasn't part of the video feed but recorded automatically. As he overlaid the movement logs, a chilling pattern emerged. The creature had been tracking the entire team long before anyone realized. Not from one direction, but from 3 separate points throughout the night. It had moved in arcs, repositioning itself strategically around the investigators, like a tactician, like a hunter that understood perimeter control. Mireya rushed back inside as Bryce projected the creature's movement paths onto a digital map. The lines traced along ridges, dips, and natural cover points, routes used by predators who understand terrain advantage. But the creature had also paused at unusual intervals, stopping at elevated positions with clear sightlines toward the team's flashlights and gear. These pauses weren't random, they were observation posts. The creature had been watching them closer and longer than anyone realized. Then came the most unsettling discovery. When the team synced the seismic sensor timestamps with the drone footage, they realized the creature manipulated its weight to control what the sensors detected. During pursuit, it moved heavily. During observation, it moved lightly, sometimes registering no impact at all. This wasn't instinct. It was adjustment, control, conscious alteration of pressure to minimize detection. No known animal performs this behavior, but military personnel do. Experienced hunters do. This creature understood more than movement. It understood stealth. The realization rippled through the room. They were not tracking it. It had been tracking them the entire night. As the crew debated their next steps, a sudden audio ping interrupted the panic. One of the remote microphones, left near the ridge, picked up a deep, resonant vocalization. Not a growl, not a roar. A long, low, harmonic pulse that vibrated through the equipment. The pitch matched the subharmonic tones recorded earlier, but this time, it carried a different pattern. 3 pulses. Pause. 2 pulses. Another pause. Almost like a signal. Almost like communication. And as the audio repeated, a cold truth settled in the room. The creature wasn't just reacting to the team. It was sending a message back. As the harmonic pulses echoed through the speakers, the entire command unit froze. The sound wasn't random. It followed structure, timing, spacing, and modulation too deliberate to be an accident. Bryce ordered an immediate comparison against known animal calls, but the database returned the same result the motion algorithm had earlier. No match. Unknown source. Mireya listened closely, then offered a chilling thought. Some primates use patterned vocal signals not to warn, but to coordinate. If the pulses were communication, then the creature wasn't alone. Before that idea could settle, the ridge microphone captured something else. Movement. Not one source, but 2, then 3. Heavy impacts spaced across different points of the forest, forming a semicircle around the abandoned sensor site. The creature they filmed might have been the one that revealed itself, but it wasn't the only one present. The realization hit with a weight none of the crew expected. The figure captured on camera seemed almost like a scout, not the dominant presence. A tester, an observer, and whatever sent the harmonic pulse might have been answering it. When the drone operator reviewed the final 10 minutes of thermal footage, he found a frame that made him step back from the monitor. There was a second heat signature, smaller but distinctly upright, watching from higher ground. It never moved, never approached. It simply stood still, observing everything below. Bryce immediately flagged the footage as highly sensitive. This was the moment the network would later refuse to air. The final blow came when the ridge microphone recorded one last vocalization, a low, rising hum that matched the earlier pattern, but with a new pulse at the end, a 4th tone. Mireya's voice trembled as she translated the implication. The pattern had changed because the situation had changed. The creature now knew it had been filmed. Bryce shut down the equipment and ordered everyone back inside camp. For the first time in the show's history, the crew agreed without argument. The night wasn't just a breakthrough, it was a warning. As the footage was sealed for review, one thought echoed through every investigator's mind. If this was the creature willing to be seen, what were the ones still hiding capable of?